that says, red or yellow, black or white, all are precious in his sight. Do you know that song? You do know that song? You know, that's a wonderful, wonderful song. I'm going to tell you a story of a man who sadly didn't seem to know that song. This is an older story that happened back in 1897. 1897. This story is about the first time in the history of our country that an Indian was allowed to be tried in a court of law for his rights. Before that, the Secretary of the Interior would just simply decide what all Indians had to do, and that's what they had to do. And as long as we had a kind and caring Secretary of the Interior, well, the Indians were taken care of. But in 1897, Secretary of the Interior was a man by the name of Cornelius Bliss. And I'm afraid he wasn't so blissful. No, he ordered that soldiers go up to northern Nebraska and at gunpoint ordered the Poncas Indians to leave their homes and travel to Indian Territory in the south. Well, that wasn't right. Those Indians held the deed to their land like anybody else. That was their property. But they were rounded up. They were marched down to Indian Territory in the south and held for months without enough food or proper medical care. And in a short time, over 1/3 of the Poncas Indians died. One of those that died was the son of Chief Standing Bear. And the chief with his grief said, I will take my son and I'm going to travel back to our lands where all my fathers were buried, and I'm going to bury my son there. So he took a horse-drawn wagon with a casket where his son was laying, and he took 30 of his strong Indians with him, and they started to travel back north. Well, Secretary Bliss heard about this, and he right away sent a telegram to Chief Crook in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, Chief Crook, you'd think he's maybe a crook, but I'm pleased to tell you that he was a nice man. He really was. And he received this telegram, and it gave him orders. Take your men and go round up Chief Standing Bear and the 30 men with him and hold them in prison. Well, Chief Crook had his orders. He was a little suspicious. He went out. Sure enough, he found Chief Standing Bear and his men traveling north. So he took them into custody. And as they were heading back to Omaha, General Crook sat on the wagon right beside Chief Standing Bear, and Chief Standing Bear told him everything that happened. Why he was traveling north. He wanted to bury his son. And at that time, General Crook decided he was going to try to do something that had never, ever been done before. He was going to appeal that this case be heard in a court of law. And he did something very interesting. It was a very wise thing. When he got back to Omaha, he went and talked to Mr. Tibbles. Now, Mr. Tibbles was the newspaper editor. Back then, you didn't read the newspaper on computers. There weren't computers. You didn't get it on your phone. You didn't watch the TV or listen to the radio. If you were going to get the news, you had to read the newspaper. And General Crook figured, if Mr. Tibbles will take up my case, I think he will help to turn the tide of popular opinion to the importance of trying the Indians in a court of law just like any other man. And it worked. Court date was scheduled. Oh, you should have seen it. This was the biggest court case ever. They called it in the West. Isn't it funny? You could think of Omaha, Nebraska as the West, but back then that was kind of the West. It was the biggest court case there had ever been, and with the most, I should say, maybe magnitude, because the decision of this court case would have a direct impact on over 100,000 people. Oh my. The room was packed with people. There were whole families that came dressed in their nicest attire. And there was General Crook and his men for the first time, and they believed it was the only time that General Crook wore his full dress uniform. He was kind of a plain man, and he would rather wear his standard military clothes. But on this day, he had his full dress uniform. There were many attorneys. They believed every attorney in the state of Nebraska traveled to this court case. The place was packed. And of course, over here in a little section all by itself was Chief Standing Bear and his 30 men. Well, one attorney who had worked tirelessly to prepare his remarks talked for 16 hours. It took 2 days. He just talked and he talked and he talked and he talked and he talked. But you know, people just felt that this was such a prominent case, they had to stay and listen. And then the third day came Mr. Webster, and he talked for 6 hours. Near the end of this court case, after both sides had pleaded their case, the judge made an announcement that surprised everybody in the courtroom. He said, now I'm going to call on Chief Standing Bear to give a few remarks on his own behalf. Oh, thought people, Chief Standing Bear. He'd been quiet the whole time. He just kind of sat there, had the lines of grief across his face, didn't seem overly engaged, just quiet. But Chief Standing Bear stood up, had the dignity of a quiet, gentle man, but a little bowed over with the weight of grief, and he walked to the front of the room. He stood half facing his audience and half facing the judge. And Chief Standing Bear, he held out his hand, and then he went silent. The silence became deafening. People started to squirm a little bit. They wondered what Chief Standing Bear was going to do. But after several moments of silence, he looked right up at the judge, and he said, my hand is not the color of yours. But if you prick it, I will bleed. And my blood is the color of yours. He said, God made me. I am a man. I have done no wrong. If I had, I would not stand here today on my own defense. I would suffer the punishment patiently. He lowered his hand and again went silent. Then he kind of gazed up. There was a big window up above where the judge sat. He looked out that window with longing eyes, and he said, I seem to be standing on a great river bank. I cannot cross the raging river. By my side is my little girl. To my other side is my wife. Behind me is an immense cliff. He still gazed out the window as he talked. He said, I then hear a great sound, and I look up the river and see a flood coming. The water quickly rises. It covers my feet, comes up my ankles and to my knees. He said, my little girl stretches out her hands to me and says, Daddy, save me. He says, I am standing where no Indian has stood. I have no tradition to follow. My fathers knew nothing of my circumstance. He says, I turn and I look at the cliff, and I see maybe a way out, a rugged, narrow trail that is steep and hard to travel. But I make my attempt. I pick up my little girl and I climb up the rough, jagged, and sharp rocks. My feet are bleeding. I'm staining the trail with my blood, and my wife follows. As I near the top of the cliff, I see through a crack in the rock a land of freedom and joy beyond. I see the green hills. I see the river running through the hills. I see the burial place of my fathers. But the chief said, there is a man who stands on that rugged trail. And behind him are soldiers, so many in number, it's like the leaves of the trees. And it is him that will decide if I can pass through or not. Then he went quiet again. And he looked that judge right in the eyes. And with a longing look, he said, you are that man. Oh, it was so quiet in that courtroom, you couldn't hear anything. There wasn't a sound. As the judge sat there, tears were just streaming down his face. Mr. Tibbles noted that he looked over at General Crook, and his face was in his hands, and he was weeping. It was quiet. But then, almost as if somebody gave the cue, the entire courtroom, every man and woman and child in that courtroom stood to their feet. And they made a rush for General Standing Bear. General Crook was the first to reach him, and Mr. Tibbles was the second. And for 1 hour, everybody stood on their feet in support of General Standing Bear. There was such a shout of support, they didn't hear the judge say that court is dismissed for today. But a few days later, they reconvened in the court as the judge gave his verdict. He said that an Indian is a man, and he affords the same rights as any other living person. Immediately, General Standing Bear and his men were released. They traveled back to their lands in northern Nebraska, and General Standing Bear buried his son. What does that song say? Red, yellow, black, or white? All are precious in his sight. Don't ever forget it. You can go back to your seat.
Amen.